Good evening. Welcome to the Deep 404. There was an article that I touched on last night, which is about NATO, and Stian Jenssen, the Chief of Staff of NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, and his comments that Ukraine may need to concede territory in order to gain access or entry into NATO. Now, I picked up this yesterday and thought about it for a while, and then this morning I watched Alexander Mercouris, and as always, Alexander has got really good insight into things. So I wanted to go back and just talk a little more about this. This is a very unusual comment to come from such a high position person at NATO, that the entry path for Ukraine could be to concede territory. Now, clearly, the territory, the recipient of conceded territory in this case would be Russia. Now, that's not stated expressly, and this whole announcement is something that would have been discussed with Stian Jenssen's superior, which is Jens Stoltenberg, who is the NATO Secretary General. Now, Jens, no doubt, would have discussed such an announcement with leaders of NATO, and that ultimately would have had some discussion and approval coming from the United States, given that the United States holds sway over NATO. So, looking at this more closely, this seems as though this is some sort of message being given to the Russians, announced by a senior but not upper echelon member of NATO, that this would be an approach. Now, what's hidden in this message is the fact that negotiation needs to happen. Obviously, the territory of Ukraine is not going to be conceded to Russia without there being no negotiation. So this seems to be indicating that NATO has reached a point where they are starting to flag and to indicate to Russia that negotiation is perhaps on the cards. They haven't come out completely outright and forthrightly said that to stop this conflict, Ukraine, you will need to provide land to Russia. But the NATO announcement, and remember that NATO aren't in this conflict. Technically, this isn't yet a NATO versus Russia war or conflict. This is Ukraine, but NATO is heavily involved, as we know, in the background with supply of weapons, and it's a proxy war with NATO fighting this via Ukraine. So to the Russians, this would sound like the US speaking through NATO to indicate that, yes, they've reached a position where they are ready to concede territory to Russia. Now, interestingly, as I said yesterday, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova, she rebuffed this and came back and said this was for political reasons. And now I think I've got a better understanding of what she meant by that. And those political reasons are that, this was hinting. However, the thing that this is missing in terms of being a satisfactory signal to the Russians is that it has not removed the NATO accession from the equation. So the statement from NATO that Ukraine, perhaps the way for you to get into NATO is to concede territory to Russia. This is something that the Russians will not accept as part of a negotiation package. Now, the whole reason that this conflict has erupted, has started, has been due to the NATO progression eastward since 1991, since the breakup of the Soviet Union. NATO has grown beyond its original boundaries and beyond just a defensive organisation, which often readily claims itself to be a defensive organisation. Yet NATO was involved in Afghanistan, and NATO was involved in Libya and Yugoslavia in the 90s. In the case of Afghanistan, NATO was able to be involved effectively under the Article 5 legislation of the NATO treaty, because America had been attacked in 9/11, and so that enabled NATO to join in the conflict there. Libya, I'm not sure what the justification was for why they became aggressive in Libya. Anyhow, NATO accession for Ukraine is something that Russia, for a long time, has indicated was just not acceptable. After the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008, when Ukraine were invited, at that stage, the American ambassador to the United States, William Burns, he reported back that this was a red line to Moscow, to the Kremlin, and to Putin, and that crossing this red line would not be accepted. So since 2008 and that invitation for Ukraine to join, the Russians have known since then that this conflict was coming. They knew that the Western pressure to put NATO troops, capability, trained soldiers, weapons, tactics, strategies into NATO was going to happen. And since 2014, this has been happening with British and American PMCs, private military companies, being involved in Ukraine, providing training to Ukrainian soldiers, turning through some number of like 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers every 2 months or something like that. That's been going on for years, since 2014. And one of the key things that Russia wants to achieve with this special military operation is the neutral status of Ukraine. They want Ukraine to be there as a land barrier between Russia and the European NATO nations. They want to avoid having Ukraine loaded up with long-range strategic missiles on the border with Russia, pointed at Moscow. Now, I think you can understand this. And look, many people, what I'm about to say, many people have discussed before. And certain people will just unsubscribe as soon as I start this. But look, that's okay. I'm just going to report what I believe has been very logically explained as a good counter-argument, or to try to present an argument as to why Russia wouldn't want NATO in Ukraine. Even though NATO, people like Michael McFaul continuously cry that NATO is a defensive organisation only. America has the Monroe Doctrine. And that means that in that Western Hemisphere that America is in, no peer competitor, no other military organisation is allowed to have offensive or threatening bases or capability in that hemisphere. So the simple story, which some of you may not have heard, many of you will have, is turn the tables and imagine if Russia or China decided that they wish to start a proxy war with the United States. And let's say China had become friendly with Canada and had begun for 8 years training Canadians in Chinese military tactics, supplying Chinese weapons, Chinese tanks, Chinese missiles, planes, armoured vehicles, munitions, artillery to the Canadians. And had announced that Canada was going to join in a military alliance, albeit a defensive one, with China and Russia. You can imagine what the United States would do. There's absolutely no way that that would eventuate. As soon as the Americans got their first whiff of that, they would come crushing down on Canada to stop anything like that happening. And I think everyone can understand that. I think a lot of the audience who watch this show are from the Northern Hemisphere. I think you can all understand. I mean, I can where I am in the Pacific, that America just would not let that happen. And I imagine if position yourself as the president of a nation, any nation, choose a nation, choose your nation, or any nation you like. You're the president of that nation. You have a neutral country next to you, and then suddenly one of your main adversaries decides that they're going to put their weapons and be friendly with that country right next door to you. Do you happily accept that and say, yeah, that's fine? Or do you see that as a threat, perhaps even an existential threat, and decide to push back against that? So the announcement from NATO, from Stian Jenssen, that Ukraine might find a way into NATO by conceding land to Russia, is only half the story that the Russians want to hear here. The other, what they want to hear is that this conflict may end by Ukraine conceding land to Russia, and Ukraine won't be entering NATO. Now, that's a challenging point when we get to negotiations, because the West and the US want Ukraine in NATO. Even if they are losing this battle with Russia, even if they're losing Ukraine and being compressed and the Ukrainian-Russian border is being pushed further westward by the day, what's remaining? They want to be Ukraine. They want it to be under a Western-aligned government, and they want it to be in NATO. Now, that's the opposite of what Russia wants. What Russia wants in there is a friendly, Russian-friendly government, no NATO, no EU, basically a buffer zone. And this is effectively what was there prior to the conflict starting a year ago. Ukraine was non-nuclear, non-NATO. It was forming that buffer zone, and I believe, and again, this is because this is the most logical story or logical explanation of what has gone on that I have been able to uncover, decipher, and align within my head with my own thinking, is that had the US not attempted to make Ukraine a NATO state, that Russia would not have commenced a special military operation and would not have moved troops into Ukraine. I've done another video a while ago on Mearsheimer and Myth, John Mearsheimer, where I talk about this. I might do another one in the future if people are interested. But that I think is a large event, this announcement from Stian Jenssen. Now, he's since tried to walk that back, saying that, what he said was a mistake and it was just in context of many other things. I think that's probably to be expected. Obviously, a lot of people have picked up on this and have said, what, you're NATO, you're effectively betraying Ukraine. If you're saying we should give 1 inch to the Russians, you're betraying us. However, I think NATO are facing the reality of shell production shortages, seeing Russia move on to a war footing, increasing its production all the time, being successful in the current military operation, and are looking to find ways to open up channels of communication, and are starting to hint and suggest at what it is that they're willing to accept and what their position is. And their position clearly now is that there needs to be concession of land from Ukraine to Russia. Now, how much land Russia it has conceded to it by Ukraine, I think depends in a large part on two things. One, when this conflict stops and when the Ukrainian leadership put their hand up and say, we are prepared to negotiate, please stop now, let's talk. And the other is, who is that Ukrainian leadership when they reach that point? If this conflict continues, and say it continues for another 4 or 5 months, say it continues into December, January of next year perhaps, given the way that Ukraine are losing equipment at the moment, given the challenges that the West are having with resupplying them, giving the morale, giving the fact that we're seeing reports now that Ukraine is talking about doing a total mobilization where all men will fight if needed. Reports of Ukrainians being persuaded to register their details in national databases and be prepared to fight the Russians at all costs if they need to. Then, if this fighting continues, there is growing indication that Ukraine will be becoming weaker and weaker over the coming months, and that they will get to a position where where Russia may well be able to just push through them. Already, and I'll come to this a little later, in the Kupiansk, the northeastern region of the main front line, there are reports of Ukrainians withdrawing from townships, of townships being evacuated, 11,000 people from 53 townships up there, with the expectation that Kupiansk will fall shortly. And once Kupiansk falls, it's likely the Russians will then roll down the Oskol River and that whole front will proceed westward. Now, as I say, if that continues, there is talk of Ukrainian preparing in advance in the Dnieper, down in Kherson. I'll come to more detail about that in a moment. But if that fails to achieve any substantial ground, for example, if it fails to reach across to the bridges of Crimea, between Kherson and Crimea, then I think it's very likely that the Russians will push in the deep south too, and they will push to take Odessa, or take at least some of Odessa, enough to secure all of the ports of Odessa, and then push upwards, perhaps to Moldova, to form a land bridge between Transnistria on the east of Moldova and what would then be Russia. So if the fighting continues, the amount of land to be conceded conceivably grows. And if it continues far enough, and Russia wishes to push all the way to the Dnieper, then you have Kiev, the city itself, the capital, coming into that equation, where the Russians, if they push to the Dnieper and they push to Kiev, who knows where they might draw the line there. And yeah, it becomes another bargaining chip for the Russians if they can then control Kiev at that stage. So how long this goes on will impact what land is conceded, but also who is in power in Ukraine at that time will impact this. If the Russians have pushed, say, that far, if they've pushed all the way to the Oskol, take it and end up taking Kharkiv, take Odessa, they're in an extremely strong bargaining position. And a Zelensky-led government in Ukraine is really not going to be able to, it has nothing to bargain with. It holds nothing. It's lost land. It doesn't hold Crimea, which was the plan of the big offensive. It has no bargaining chips. So Russia in that position is in the dominant position and can then effectively request what they want. And I think that a part of that would be a regime change, because this is the perfect position to implement regime change. you don't. It's not just done through a coup and an election, which can become. They're very fragile, often maintaining those puppet governments installed that way. This way, in effect, you have a mandate. You have the upper hand, and you basically say to the Americans, "We want so and so to be in power here. They're friendly to us. They will guarantee this area remains neutral." And then I think that ultimately the US will need to accept that, unless the US are able to, conduct some other activity in another part of the world, to put some other pressure on Russia. But there has been a year and a half of sanctions, which hasn't stopped the Russians. There's been growing support for Russia from the global south, from Africa. There's been growing trade between Russia and China and India and the global south. The Americans are losing their ability to put sanctions pressure on the Ukrainians, on the Russians, sorry. So unless they could find some other geopolitical lever to pull against the Russians, I think that ultimately there will be a lot of spin, but effectively Russia will be deciding where the line is and what the new border of Ukraine looks like. So this is just one to watch, see what continues to be said about this, see if we start to hear in the coming weeks and months more stories about the West looking for ways to communicate and start some form of negotiations with Russia. Talking a little bit now about the battlefront and what's been happening. I'll just get the map up here. I'm just going to start in the north, right up in the north, up near Belarus and Bryansk. So Bryansk is in Russia, up here. This is Kiev down here. I think maybe about 60 k's or something. Maybe it's a little more, 80 k's from, say, it's Bryansk region. Oh no, so a lot further, 220 k's to Kiev. In Bryansk, there are reports in the last 24 hours of Ukrainian saboteurs, infiltration squads moving across the border into Russia. The Russian reporting, which is backed up by some video footage, indicates that those squads were detected and were stopped, and without returning to Ukraine. Moving down a little from this region down towards Belgorod here. So Belgorod again in Russia. Belgorod not far from Kharkiv. There has been ongoing artillery duels in the Belgorod and Kharkiv, between those areas on the border in between. Belgorod has suffered under some shelling, some drone attacks, and some incursions by Ukrainian troops to Belgorod over the past couple of months. But there seems to be now some intensification of the artillery activity along this area of the line here. We're starting to hear more about it when we haven't heard a great deal in the past from there. Kupiansk, which we've talked about, it's Kupiansk at the top of this red line where the Russians are moving themselves westward, getting closer once Kupiansk falls, getting themselves closer to obviously looking to retake Kharkiv here. Heavy fighting is reported. There are reports of right up here near Kupiansk in Sinkovka here of Ukrainian troops retreating or withdrawing from here. Reports that there are around 53 of these little townships all around here to the west and south of Kupiansk that are being evacuated. in preparation for what is expected to be a Russian push across the Oskol River and into Kupiansk itself here. Moving down south here and into the area around Bakhmut. So in Bakhmut here with Klishchiivka here, which is the south of Bakhmut. This is where there has been intense fighting for the last month. The Ukrainians trying to get around to the south, trying to perhaps get to this access road up into Bakhmut to try to reclaim some of Bakhmut. Bakhmut has become one of those battles, one of those towns in Ukraine that seem to have been just burned into the psyche of the Ukrainians, and they would desperately love to be able to claim or reclaim Bakhmut. That would be a huge moral and PR advantage for the Ukrainians if that were to occur. However, Russian reporting is that they have seen some attacks from the northeast of Bakhmut through this area here, which is perhaps being enacted by troops who are being pulled out from Klishchiivka and being sent north to Kupiansk to try to hold the line in Kupiansk in the north. And perhaps some thought that as some of those groups are moving up, they are getting involved in some attacks or supporting in some attacks, and then heading, and continuing their way up to Kupiansk. Then the Donetsk region, so south of Kupiansk, south of Bakhmut, Donetsk here. There seems to be a growing push from the Russians to the west of Donetsk around here to try to push and break through Ukrainian defenses here. If they're able to break through the line here, then the thinking is that they may then be able to move across to support the Russian forces around the Varemka ledge, this area here. So in this Varemka ledge area, heading down here from Varemka, Skuchne, Storozhev, Makarivka, and now down to Staromayorsk and Urozhny. Now, Staromayorsk has been captured by the Ukrainians, so the Ukrainians have worked their way down here. As I was saying yesterday, the advance they have made here has not come cheaply. The video that came out yesterday of Staromayorsk, that was counted 28 or 30 pieces of Ukrainian armored equipment destroyed in this area here. Staromayorsk, from very top to bottom, is 2.5 kilometers, 2,500 meters. So there's obviously been very, very heavy fighting in that area. The whole distance, if we go then from, say, Vremivka down to Urozhny, and this has been perhaps one of the biggest advances made. It's a total distance of about 12 kilometers, and this is 12 kilometers in a thin strip down this river, down the road here. This is not a wide area or front that the Ukrainians have managed to create here. So Staromayorsk here has been captured by the Ukrainians. Urozhny here has been captured, and Ukrainians now have fire control over the roads to the south of Urozhny. So this road down here, and this road down here. The Ukrainians have fire control over that now. So the next likely township for them to attempt to capture would be Zavitne Bazania here. Now, the challenge that the Ukrainians start to encounter here, as you can see, to the west of them, there's a lot of open space, not many settlements around there close by. To the right of them, it's the same again. So you can see how they've followed this tube or this line, this column down here. Now, as they get down to Zavitny, again, they're burrowing further and further down and becoming surrounded again on both flanks, and needing to keep this entire 12-15 kilometer front on both sides secured to allow troops to get in and move down. Now, that's obviously a very, very tough call. Military Summary Channel, he was talking about this. He does great episodes on the tactical minutiae of the daily activity in Ukraine, and he was suggesting that the way forward here is that a broad front needs to be established, so that effectively from Novosilka over here to the west and out to the east, the same sort of distance, the Ukrainians need to be able to push all of that down here to be able to give themselves a much wider ability to push down. Even from here, where they are now, we can see there is still a terribly long way to go from here. So even though Regina has now been captured, if they move on to Zavetin next, then they still have, if they were to head to Berdyansk or Mariupol, the distance is not insignificant. It's 90 kilometers to the Sea of Azov there. So that's a lot of hard fighting to get that far. Moving over to the Orikhiv area here and Robotny. Now, again, there has been very heavy fighting around Robotny, and Robotny has become interesting as there is speculation now that the Ukrainians are drawing or being forced to draw upon some of their last reserves of the brigades that were trained up by NATO in preparation for this big push. This is due to the fact that what appears to be north of Robotny, there's video emerging of strikers, video of 3 of them being destroyed today, 2 Leopard tanks being destroyed in this area, and the thing that is triggering people to think that these are reserve forces is the appearance of challenges starting to turn up in some pictures, and I believe even a video today of the Challengers around this area. Now, until this stage, the Challenger tanks have been kept out of the fighting, have been kept away from the front line. So if they are now being pushed down into Robotny, many are suggesting that's an indication that the Ukrainians are needing to draw on those reserves now in order to keep the fight going in this area. Ukraine in Robotny itself here. Now, Ukraine controls the top half, the northern part of Robotny. Russia seems to still have fire control over Robotny, or at least the southern area. And they have fire control over this main road here, making further advancement tough for the Ukrainians. There's also video coming out that the Russians are using the distance mining technique around this area, where there is some video of these trucks, look to be like a six-wheeler sort of vehicle, a squat, not a high-cabbed thing, with a couple of launcher units, almost looking like a cut wasp nest, a disc with a number of holes in them. They seem to contain a shell. Some types of them, they will then contain a howitzer type shell. Those can be fired as well. These look like a slightly different deployment technique, but they contain within them a number of anti-tank mines. Depending on the mechanism used to deploy them, if they're being launched from the howitzer shells, they can be scattered at a distance of between 2.5 to 10 miles away. So you're able to, the Russians are effectively, what I believe is happening here is like from the south of Robotny, they are able to distance mine over to the north of Robotny. And so as the Ukrainians are pushed back, they're being pushed back and being cut off because they're being forced to backtrack over land which they may have demined, which has now been remined by this distance mining method by the Russians. It reports also interesting here that today it appears that the push down into Robotny may have slowed, and the Ukrainians are looking to push to the east, to Verbove in this area here, trying to push across there. Now that might be in an attempt to get to this main supply road here, start to cut off some of that supply between here and Tokmak. As they work down this supply road towards Tokmak, if they can cut this second one here and control that, then they're slowly starting to cut off some of the resupply routes to Tokmak. I imagine that the fighting in the area here of Piatikatki, where again the Ukrainians lost a lot of forces trying to claim Piatikatki, that part of the idea here would have been to come down to cut this road leading in to Tokmak, so that Tokmak then becomes more difficult for the Russians to resupply and defend. Okay, moving down, more interesting news today. Moving down to Kozachi Lahari in the Kherson region. So just get this on the map. Okay, so a couple of days ago we were talking about Kozachi Laheri, this area here, which is just to the northeast of the Antonovsky Bridge in Kherson. A couple of weeks ago, there was a Russian head of the area speaking and suggesting that he believed that the Ukrainians were building up forces to mount an attack across the Dnieper River. Now, that happened a couple of days ago with Ukrainian forces moving through these islands using boats, and they did establish in the west of Kozachi Laheri here a bit of a bridgehead. However, that was pushed back by some heavy bombing by the Russians. They were pushed out of this area. However, it doesn't look like the Ukrainian attacks in this area are going to stop. There are reports of 1,500 Ukrainian soldiers building up in this area, and it appears as though they may be looking to make another attack on Kozachi Laheri in a larger force and try to claim and capture that area in its entirety. There have also been attempts a little further to the northeast here at Lvov. Russians have been bombing this area, as it appears as though Ukrainians may have been preparing forces here to make an assault across the river in this area here. And then finally, there are some reports coming out that the Ukrainians may even be looking to move down from this area here near south of Nikolaev, and move perhaps across the water and get themselves around here near Zalizny port, perhaps, to try to then support these attacks from Kozati Laheri around this area to come in and support this way. So to get behind some of the Russian forces, distract them and split them, so they're having to fight and down to the southwest as well as fighting up to the northeast here. So definitely interesting things starting to happen on the front line, some other developments. There are reports coming out indicating that the Ukrainians are starting to use reserves and need to use the lasts, perhaps, of their reserves in the fighting. This will be of interest to see if they really are getting to the bottom of their reserves. As we've said, there are reports of a coming total mobilization for Ukraine, fighting to the last man, every man fighting. So Ukraine will be able to provide more soldiers to go into this fight for some time. So even if they are reaching the end of their highly trained and NATO trained reserve brigades now, they will be developing more of them in the background. The northern Kupiansk area is appearing to become a real challenge for the Ukrainians. And if that does open up, if Kupiansk falls and that really begins to open up, then I think we might start to have to question if the Russians themselves would look to make an advance. Have the Russians got plans to advance if Kupiansk falls to Kharkiv? Quite possibly. I would imagine that they have military planners who are preparing for that contingency. It may not be that it is a big planned, big arrow push at this stage. It may simply be if they feel that the line is weak enough, they're able to break it, and the Ukrainians begin to retreat, and they're retreating to areas that are not well defended, that they haven't had time to prepare solid defences, that the Russians may just look to push their hand as far as they can and chase them back as far as they can. We'll see. That may be coming, I guess. All right. I think that's enough for tonight. Thank you very much if you've watched this or listened to this. I appreciate it. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe, and I will talk to you soon.